Monday morning, and Norman Normal is having breakfast, a nice cup of tea and a boiled egg. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was Mr. Shitsack from the Conservative and Unionist Party, and he very much would like Norman to vote for him in the upcoming elections. Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. Tuesday morning, Norman is having a bacon sandwich with a lovely cup of tea. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Who could this be? Norman wondered. It was Smear Stomer from the Labour Party. He said everything was the Conservatives' fault, and the Labour Party would do everything differently. Even though all the policies sounded exactly the same, Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. It's Wednesday morning, a beautiful sunny day. The birds are singing and the sun is shining. Norman is having cornflakes for breakfast. Suddenly, there is a knock on the door. "Who on earth is that?" said Norman. He was getting fed up with the repetition and lazy animation. It was Dead Wavy from the Liberal Democrats. He said everything was the Conservative and Labour Party's fault, and they would do everything differently, even though his policies sounded exactly the same. He would like Norman to vote for him. Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. Norman is very cross. His cup of tea has gone cold, and he realizes that all the political parties are exactly the same. They represent big business and the military-industrial complex, and not the people who vote them in to represent them. If only there was a way to tell them we don't want any of them. Norman doesn't know what to do, so he turns on the radio, makes another cup of tea, and sits at the kitchen table when a little song comes on.
If you are feeling dispossessed, wondering what course of action is best, here's a worthy note. Go ahead and spoil your vote and write upon it, "I do not consent." Every vote is counted, you see. It's a right that's been bequeathed to you and me, Tory, Labour, Liberals and Greens. Don't understand what this means. Removing them from power is easier than it seems. The majority of people do not vote. Tacit agreement from the most. If they exercised their right, there's no need to stand and fight. We can remove the parasites from the host.
It's Thursday morning, it's raining and gloomy, it's voting day. And Norman knows exactly what to do. For the first time in his life, Norman was going to spoil his ballot and write across it, "I do not consent." Norman leaves the house and sets out on the short walk to the voting station. Something amazing happened. Hundreds of people were doing the same thing, leaving the house to show the political class that we no longer have faith in them and spoil their ballot. People who had stopped voting years ago turned up to write, "I do not consent," on their ballot. Mr. Normal wrote, "I do not consent." Mr. Farmer wrote, "I do not consent." Mr. Inner City Violence wrote, "I do not consent." Mr. Ex-Veteran wrote, "I do not consent." Little Miss Nurse wrote, "I do not consent." And so did everyone in the town. Jubilant Mr. Normal returned home, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table to wait for the result. A little after midnight, the news came in. "In a free and fair election, I do not consent has it. I repeat, I do not consent has it." Everybody in Happy Town was over the moon. It turned out that everyone in the country had voted the same way. And that's the end of our story from me and Mr. Normal. Goodbye. Please look out for our next story. Mr. King has a constitutional crisis. Coming soon. It's Monday morning,